For more on the shooting story, we're joined from Kabul by Associated Press reporter Heidi Vogt. Heidi, welcome. Has the arrest of the soldier, the regrets and concerns expressed by senior U.S. officials, done anything to tamp down the reaction on the Afghan side?
Well, we have seen a mixture of outrage and some understanding on the part of the Afghan government. Hamid Karzai had a very exclamatory statement at the beginning, but at the same time, we haven't seen any protests today in Afghanistan, which is what a lot of people were worried about. It's unclear if that's as a result of what the Americans have done or if the news is just taking a little while to get out to people.
Were there already tensions in Afghanistan over how foreign troops accused of crimes in the country are treated?
Yeah, the tensions have really been high recently. It's been this year we had in January a video emerged of U.S. Marines urinating on what looked like Taliban corpses. And then, of course, the Koran burnings just a couple weeks ago and the riots that then killed 30 people. So we already had a really high level of strife going on. We thought it was started to subside recently this week, but this has really ratcheted it up again.
We know the accused, or about to be accused, is 38 years old, has been in service for 11 years. Do we know much more about him?
We do know that he did 3 tours in Iraq, and this was his first tour in Afghanistan. Just arrived in Afghanistan in December and only moved out to this small base in Panjwai district about 6 weeks ago. So he's a pretty new arrival to the area where the attack happened.
Does this crime differ from the kinds of things that have killed Afghan civilians in previous incidents?
Well, that's a good question because obviously it does, right? I mean, this is an unprecedented event. A U.S. soldier just going out of his base, killing 16 people in the dead of the night. But to Afghans, it's unclear if it feels so different. These are people who have been dealing with years of airstrikes that have sometimes inadvertently killed civilians, with attacks that they feel are unjustified at times. And I mean, there was an attack in 2008 that the officials said killed 90 people. And to many Afghans, those feel just as criminal as this most recent attack. And so for them, it may not feel as different.
Apart from this most recent incident, have casualties among Afghan civilians been down in general? Because earlier it had been a major headache for NATO commanders, hadn't it?
Well, it depends on how you measure it, because Afghan civilian casualties have been rising each year, and in 2011, more Afghan civilians died than in any previous year. But the majority of those casualties are from insurgent attacks. We're talking about the roadside bombs. We're talking about people who attack in markets and in government buildings. NATO-related casualties have actually gone down in the same time.
Has there been any question of how this all happened in the Afghan public? This is quite an unusual thing for one person working on their own to be able to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what we've been hearing from the villagers in recent days. People saying, who is this guy? How did he get out? How is someone just wandering around? There have been people saying on both sides, the American and the Afghan side, this must be a crazy man. This must be someone who was, drunk or out of his wits somehow. But there's also conspiracy theories going. There are Afghans who have said, we think this guy must have been ordered to do this. Otherwise, how would he have gotten out of a base? So there's a lot of rumors.
Does this threaten the negotiations for some sort of approach, some sort of process with the Taliban?
Well, that's a good question in terms of it's a very delicate sort of process we're going through right now that involves the Afghan government and the American government trusting each other a lot. This certainly risks undermining that trust. Also, there's the question of whether this growing anti-American sentiment makes things easier for the Taliban, emboldens them even, and makes them feel like they don't need to come to the negotiating table. And if that's true, it will be much harder to have any sort of talks with them.
Heidi Vogt of the Associated Press joined us from Kabul. Good to talk to you.
Of course.
General John Allen, the commander of U.S. and NATO troops in Afghanistan, told CNN the shooting was a regrettable, isolated incident that will not derail a resilient U.S.-Afghan relationship. Not everyone agrees. We turn now to Seth Jones, who worked for the commander of U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2011 and is now a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, and Steve Clemons, editor-at-large at The Atlantic and director of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation. First, we had the desecration of the corpses. Then we had the burning of the Quran. Is this strike three?
Well, I think it's strike three. I know that there's a difference of opinion out there, but it's hard to imagine an incident that could become more viral, and not only in what the tragedy of what just unfolded, but of being something that the Taliban can exploit over time, because there's such an immediate call now for justice against or from the person who allegedly committed these crimes. And our U.S. military system of justice is going to run right against the Afghan expectation of how their justice system should work. So this incident will remain ripe and alive for a long period of time, and I think be very substantial in souring a relationship and changing the dynamics of how President Karzai makes his choices in the future and how he positions himself vis-a-vis the United States.
Seth Jones, can this single incident or the accumulation of incidents sour that relationship?
I think it will be unhelpful, but I don't think it will ultimately be a third strike. And I think when you look at the situation in context, I would say a couple of things stand out. One is that the Taliban still is killing, as the previous interview indicated, the vast majority of civilians in Afghanistan. So from an Afghan population sense, again, I would say they have dealt with 3 decades now of civilian casualties. So this is not as out of the norm as it's appearing now in the American media. The second thing I would say that's important is there has to be an effort from the American commander to go on the ground and talk to the families and the local tribal elders and express his condolences.
But, you know, we saw the president, we saw the Secretary of State, we saw the NATO and U.S. Forces commander all come out today and bend over backwards to say that they were sorry about this. Doesn't that reflect that it's more than just the media reacting?
No, I think in context of the recent Quran burnings, this is a strategic issue. But I still think in the broader context, we've got Afghanistan has suffered 3 decades of war. It will probably continue to suffer several decades more of war. So I do think the issue the president's probably having to deal with more than anything else is a domestic one. He now has his party, which does not support the war in Afghanistan, and a growing number now of some of the Republican candidates don't either.
Let's talk about the domestic effect, not only here, but also in Afghanistan. We heard Heidi Vogt just now talk about the effect on negotiations with the Taliban. Do you think that this has there's a direct connection?
Well, I think this has given the Taliban an edge and a piece of very valuable propaganda. I think that whatever may be going on behind the scenes in trying to negotiate some deal with the Taliban, with the Afghan government's inclusion and the Pakistan government allowing it to happen, that the correlation of forces, if you will, just shifted a bit more towards the Taliban, that whatever edge we thought we might have had gave way somewhat with this incident. And I think that, you know, to a certain degree, and I agree with Seth that this has been, you know, such a cauldron of horror for so long for so many people, that part of the issue internally is the Taliban have done awful things, but the United States was the trusted player. Many Afghans look at the fact that inside their country they see Iran, they see China, they see India, they see other meddling inside their domestic operation. And the U.S. was supposed to be the trusted ally. And this makes it easier.
It didn't sound like that coming from Hamid Karzai.
No. And I don't think he can position himself to be that close to the United States while there is so much anger about this incident. And I think that really does damage the ability to talk, because what most Afghans are beginning to realize, and they've acquiesced to, is the U.S. is on its way out. And they see 2 or 3 more decades of turmoil and civil war as being the life they're likely to have. And this makes the punctuation point of a departure point with the United States easier. And that's really tragic.
Part of what was supposed to make this go more smoothly was the creation of programs like this Village Stabilization Program, where U.S. forces were inserted into the countryside and helped to smooth things out and create some sort of stability. This is where this came from. This is where this fellow allegedly came from. Does that end this program?
Actually, no. I think when you look at the village stability operations and the Afghan local police program across both the East and the South, that actually has contributed to a decline of Taliban control of territory more than almost any other program. So, in fact, it's been quite successful. And the concerns that most people had is that this was building Afghan militia, and it was these militia forces that were going to turn predatory. Actually, ironically, it was an American soldier operating out in rural areas that committed the most recent abuse rather than the Afghans themselves.
How about the timetable? There is a timetable for withdrawal of U.S. forces. Does this sort of thing speed it up? Does it slow it down? Does it make people here or there more nervous about it?
Well, Seth and I may disagree about this, and we're, to some degree speculating, but we had a bit of tug of war between General John Allen and the White House about what the timeline would be. John Allen wanted to keep those forces in place as long as he could up until the departure date. The White House, and particularly Vice President Biden, made it very clear that there would be a paced drawdown, meaning segments by segment, that we would not draw down the full balance of forces all at the end of 2014. My sense is that with Leon Panetta's comments recently that combat operations would stop in 2013, that you're beginning to see something that's a combination of strategy and looking at an increasingly toxic environment that I think will make that drawdown faster and more robust on the front end. I could be wrong, but it's also tied to what the Taliban want and what these negotiations come out. There's a set of negotiations that we don't see happening in which both sides are trying to position in how they deal with each other. And to some degree, I think Panetta's comments were in part signaling to the Taliban what a posture will be. Not a concession, but what's possible. And I suspect that the pressure to bring our troops home more quickly will increase.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think what's unclear right now, and the administration has been very careful on what it's said, is that it's unclear what happens in 2013, 2014, and beyond. Will that mean 0 U.S. forces? I've never heard anybody privately say that means 0. The talk now is 15 or 20 or 25, somewhere in that category. I think the subject of discussion now is, will this be mostly a move away from a conventional counterinsurgency model to more special operations and CIA units, much like the U.S. Was involved in the Philippines or Colombia or El Salvador? That's a very different model than what the U.S. has been involved in over the last several years.
Final thought, and it's something that Steve Clements referred to early on in our conversation, which is that there might not be a lot of patience for the American version of justice in this sort of thing. That here we have an alleged shooter whose name we still don't know. They want to charge him first. They want to take him through the U.S. justice system, and there may not be any stomach for that.
I think it's really one of the things that I worry about most. This is not a drone attack. This is not some accident or something where you've got a machine, a mechanism, or something that's nameless behind it. There's going to be a person's name attached to this crime, and there's going to be an appetite in Afghanistan for immediate and severe and quick and they would say appropriate justice. And I don't think our system can generate that. And every day that this person remains outside of what the Afghans would consider to be appropriate justice, the Taliban have something to wave a flag around and to continue to rile emotions and to destabilize what was already a very, very bad situation inside Afghanistan.
And yet no protests today yet.
No protests. Again, I would say Afghans, for better or worse, definitely for worse, are used to being killed. The issue here of the Quran burnings and an insult to Islam was what led to the broader
they're used to being killed on purpose in a targeted way with children and women involved?
Well, again, when you sit down, as I have with many local Afghan villagers, they will count over the last 3 decades multiple instances of their children, their fathers, their uncles who have been killed in a range of horrific ways.
Seth Jones, Steve Clements, thank you both very much.
Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you, Gwen.